I had been delivering food for almost 3 years before the night I realized how easily a normal delivery could turn into something you couldn't explain to anyone without sounding paranoid. It was a Thursday in late November, cold enough that I kept the heat running in my car between deliveries, and business had been unusually slow. I was working the evening shift because I needed the extra money for rent, and by around 10:30 p.m., I was already thinking about calling it a night. Then my phone buzzed with another order. It was from a restaurant about 4 miles away, going to a house in a residential area on the edge of town. The payout wasn't great, but it was close enough to where I lived that I accepted it. I remember looking at the delivery notes while I waited for the food. They said, "Please leave at the side door. Front door is broken." Nothing about that seemed strange. A lot of older houses had broken doors, and customers often asked drivers to use side entrances. I picked up the order, checked the address twice, and followed the GPS through quiet streets where most of the houses had their porch lights off. When I turned onto the customer street, I noticed how dark it was. There were street lights, but several were burned out, leaving long stretches of road almost completely black. The house was near the end of a cul-de-sac, a small two-story place with peeling white siding and a narrow driveway. The GPS announced that I had arrived, and I pulled into the driveway. There was no porch light, but I could see a weak yellow glow coming from somewhere inside the house. I grabbed the food and walked around the side like the instructions said. The side door was behind a wooden fence, and when I reached it, I noticed the door wasn't broken at all. It looked perfectly intact. There was even a working handle and a small window beside it. I hesitated, wondering if I had the wrong house, but the address on the mailbox matched the one in the app. I knocked lightly and stepped back. Nothing happened. I knocked again. Still nothing. I was about to leave the food beside the door when I heard something move inside. It sounded like a chair scraping across the floor. I waited. A few seconds later, a man's voice said, "Just leave it there." His voice was low and tired. I replied, "Sure." I placed the bag on the ground and took a picture for the delivery confirmation. As I stood up, the door opened about 2 inches. I could see one eye through the gap. The man said, "Did you see anyone outside?" I thought he was asking whether someone else had come to the house, so I said, "No, it's just me." He stared at me for another second. Then he said, "Okay, thanks." The door closed. I walked back toward my car, but halfway down the driveway I stopped. I had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was watching me. I looked over my shoulder. The side door was closed. The windows were dark except for the faint yellow glow upstairs. I got into my car and drove away. I didn't think much about it until about 20 minutes later when I received another order. I was sitting in a gas station parking lot when the app showed me the delivery address. It was the exact same house. I assumed it was a glitch. Sometimes customers placed multiple orders by accident, especially if the first one hadn't arrived. I accepted it because I was curious, and when I arrived, I saw something that immediately made me uncomfortable. My food delivery was supposed to be from a different restaurant, but the customer name was different. The first order had been under the name Daniel. This one was under the name Marcus. Same address. Same side door. I parked across the street instead of pulling into the driveway. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds watching the house. There was no movement. Then the side door opened slightly. The same man stepped out. I couldn't see his face clearly because he was standing in shadow, but I recognized the dark sweatshirt and jeans he had been wearing earlier. He looked toward my car. I got out with the food. He walked toward me but stopped several feet away. "You're the same driver," he said. Yeah, I replied. Another order. He looked confused. I didn't order anything. I showed him my phone. It's under Marcus. Same address. He took one step closer and looked at the screen. His expression changed immediately. Don't bring it here. I thought I had misunderstood him. What? He looked past me toward the street. Don't bring it to the house. Take it back? I asked. Is there a problem with the order? He lowered his voice. Just don't come any closer. Then he turned and hurried back inside. I stood there holding the bag, completely confused. The app wouldn't let me cancel without contacting support, so I called the customer number attached to the order. A man answered. I asked, Hi, I'm at the address for the Marcus delivery. Are you here? There was silence. Then the man on the phone said, What address? I read it out. He immediately said, I don't live there. My stomach tightened. I told him the order had been placed through the delivery app and the address was listed under his name. He said, I didn't order anything. Then he hung up. I stared at the house. The man who had spoken to me was still inside. I called support and explained everything. The representative told me they would cancel the order and asked me to return the food to the restaurant. I was about to leave when I noticed a second-floor curtain move. I couldn't see anyone behind it, but the curtain shifted slowly and then stopped. I got into my car and drove away. I didn't tell the police because at that point I didn't have anything concrete. A strange customer had told me not to approach his own house, and someone had apparently placed an order under another person's name. It was creepy, but not necessarily a crime. I finished 2 more deliveries and finally went home around midnight. The next morning, I woke up to a notification from the delivery app asking me to rate my last customer. I opened it without thinking. The last customer listed wasn't the restaurant order I'd delivered after the strange house. It was the first delivery of the night. Daniel, the app showed that the customer had rated me 5 stars. Under the rating was a message. Thanks for coming back. I knew you'd recognize the house. I immediately felt cold. I hadn't mentioned to anyone that I had returned to that house. I checked the delivery history. The second order had disappeared completely as if it had never existed. I contacted support again, but they told me they couldn't discuss another customer's account. I asked whether the rating could be removed. They said they would investigate it. I tried to forget about the whole thing. For the next few days, nothing happened. Then, 4 nights later, I was delivering again when I received a notification from the app. It was a new order from the same restaurant I'd picked up from that first night. The destination was a different address, about 6 miles away. I almost declined it because I didn't want to deal with another strange customer, but the payout was high, so I accepted. When I arrived at the address, I noticed there was no house there. It was an empty lot beside an abandoned building. I checked the GPS. The PIN was correct. I called the customer. No answer. I was about to mark the delivery as undeliverable when a text came through from an unknown number. It said, "You're getting better at finding the right places." I froze. Another message appeared before I could react. Next time, don't look through the windows. I slowly looked up at the abandoned building across from me. There was a second-floor window facing the parking lot. The glass was completely black. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a car door close. The car door slammed behind me, and for a second I couldn't move. I was standing beside my delivery car with my phone still in my hand, staring at the dark second-floor window of the abandoned building. I slowly turned around, expecting to see someone walking toward me, but the parking lot was empty. My car was the only vehicle there. I checked the time. It was 11:47 p.m. I remember thinking that the sound must have come from somewhere on the road, but there hadn't been any traffic for at least a minute. Then my phone vibrated again. The unknown number had sent another message. "You should leave." I didn't reply. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing followed me. I drove directly home and deleted the conversation, telling myself that someone was messing with me. For the next week, I tried not to think about it. I stopped accepting late-night orders for a while and worked mostly during the afternoon. Then, one Saturday night, I made the mistake of taking an order from a customer named Ashley. The restaurant was busy, and the order took almost 20 minutes to prepare. When I finally picked it up, the delivery address was a small apartment complex on the other side of town. The instructions said, "Building C, 3rd floor. Please don't knock. Call when you're outside." That was normal enough. Apartment deliveries were usually straightforward, although I hated going into unfamiliar buildings late at night. When I arrived, I parked under a streetlight and called the customer. A woman answered almost immediately. "Are you here?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm outside Building C." There was a pause. "Okay, come up to the 3rd floor. Apartment 307. The elevator isn't working, so use the stairs." I looked at the building. The lobby lights were on, and I could see a few people through the glass doors. I grabbed the food and went inside. The hallway smelled like old carpet and cigarette smoke. I climbed 2 flights of stairs and reached the 3rd floor. Apartment 307 was at the very end of the hallway. Before I could knock, the door opened about an inch. A woman's voice whispered, "Come in." I immediately stepped back. "I'm just going to leave it here," I said. "No, please," she whispered. "Just put it inside." There was something strange about her voice. She sounded frightened. I placed the bag on the floor beside the door. "It's paid for. Have a good night." I turned around. "Wait," she said. I stopped. "Can you do me a favor?" I looked back at the door. "What kind?" "Go downstairs and tell the man at the front desk that someone is following me." I didn't know what to say. "Is someone outside your apartment?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "He's been standing across the hall for 20 minutes. I looked toward the opposite side of the hallway. There was a closed apartment door. I couldn't see anyone. "Do you want me to call the police?" I asked. "No," her answer came instantly. "Don't call them from here." That made me more uncomfortable. I said, "Okay, I'm going downstairs." I walked toward the stairs, trying not to run. When I reached the corner, I looked back. The hallway was empty. I went downstairs and walked through the lobby. The front desk was unattended. There was a small security office behind a glass partition, but nobody was inside. I called Ashley again. No answer. I sent a message through the app asking if she was okay. No response. I decided to leave. As I stepped outside, I noticed a man standing beside the building across the parking lot. He was wearing a black jacket and baseball cap. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, looking toward Building C. I got into my car and watched him through the windshield. He turned his head and looked directly at me. Then he started walking toward my car. I locked the doors. He stopped about 10 feet away. "You deliver here?" he asked. I didn't answer. "I'm asking if you deliver here." I started the engine. He raised both hands slightly. "Relax, I'm just trying to find someone." I drove away without responding. About 10 minutes later, Ashley called me through the app. I answered using speakerphone. Are you okay? I asked. She was breathing heavily. Did you talk to him? Who? The man outside? I said, yeah, but I left. She was silent. Then she asked, what did he look like? I described his black jacket and cap. She whispered, that's not him. I felt my grip tighten around the steering wheel. What do you mean? The man I'm afraid of isn't wearing a black jacket. Before I could ask anything else, she said, you need to check your back seat. The call ended. I almost laughed because I was so nervous. It sounded like something from a horror movie, and I knew there was nobody in my back seat. Still, I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and got out. I opened the rear doors. The seats were empty. There was nothing on the floor. I checked the trunk too. Nothing. I called Ashley back. No answer. Then I noticed something tucked underneath the driver's seat. It was a small folded piece of paper. I pulled it out. Written across the front in black ink were 3 words, "You were right." I stared at it for several seconds. I had no idea what it meant. I took a picture and sent it to Ashley. She immediately replied, "Where did you get that?" I told her it had been under my seat. She stopped responding. I called again. Nothing. I drove home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside my car. I checked the locks and searched the entire vehicle. There were no signs of forced entry. The next morning, I contacted the delivery company and reported the incident. They told me they would flag the customer's account, but because no direct threat had been made, there wasn't much they could do. I also considered calling the police, but I didn't have enough information to explain what had happened. I couldn't prove the note was connected to Ashley, and I couldn't even prove someone had been inside my car. 2 weeks passed. Then I received a new delivery request from the same apartment complex. I recognized the address immediately and almost declined. But the restaurant was paying a surge bonus, and I was trying to catch up on bills. I accepted. This time the customer was a man named Kevin, his instructions said. Building C, 3rd floor, apartment 307. I stared at the screen for almost a full minute. I thought about canceling, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, the parking lot looked completely normal. I walked into Building C and took the stairs. Apartment 307 was at the end of the hall. The door was closed. I knocked once. Nothing. I knocked again. A man's voice answered from inside. "Leave it there." I placed the bag on the floor. Before I could turn around, he opened the door. He was probably in his 40s, wearing a gray shirt and jeans. He looked at the food, then at me. "You're the delivery driver?" he asked. Yes, his expression changed. "Were you here a couple weeks ago?" I felt a chill run through me. I deliver here sometimes. He looked toward the stairwell. "Did a woman ask you for help?" I didn't answer. He smiled slightly. I knew it. I stepped backward. "Who are you?" He ignored the question. "She told you about the man following her, didn't she?" I said nothing. He leaned against the doorframe. "She's not in there anymore." I looked past him into the apartment. The place was almost completely empty. No furniture. No pictures. No signs that anyone lived there. "Where is she?" I asked. He smiled again. "That's the thing. Nobody ever lived here." My stomach dropped. "Then who placed the order?" I asked. His smile disappeared. "That's what I've been trying to figure out." He suddenly looked frightened. He stepped out into the hallway and lowered his voice. "Listen to me. Someone has been using this apartment to meet delivery drivers." I asked, "Why?" He looked down the hallway. "I don't know. But you're not the first one. Then I heard footsteps coming from the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing toward us. The man immediately stepped back inside his apartment. "Don't move," he whispered. I stood frozen in the hallway. The footsteps stopped on the second floor. Silence followed. Then my phone vibrated. I looked down. I had received a new delivery request. The pickup location was the restaurant from my very first delivery. The destination was apartment 307, and beneath the address was a note that made my blood run cold. This time, "Bring your car keys inside." I stared at the delivery request on my phone until the screen dimmed, then tapped it awake again because I was convinced I had misread the note. This time, "Bring your car keys inside." The man standing in apartment 307 was watching me from behind the partially open door. He had gone completely pale. "What does it say?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I turned the phone toward him. He read the message and immediately shook his head. "You need to leave." I looked toward the stairwell. The footsteps were still somewhere below us. "Who is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," he said, "and I don't want to find out." He stepped farther into the apartment and motioned for me to follow. I didn't move. "You said nobody lived here." "They don't." "Then why are you here?" He hesitated. "Because I'm the property manager." That explained why he had access to the apartment, but it didn't explain the woman, the orders, or the messages. I told him I was leaving, and he nodded. I turned toward the stairs. The footsteps started again. Someone was coming up? I moved quickly down the hallway and reached the stairwell. A man appeared on the landing below. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low, and he was carrying something in one hand. I couldn't see what it was. He stopped when he saw me. Neither of us spoke. Then he took one step upward. I immediately turned around and ran back toward apartment 307. The property manager pulled the door open and grabbed my arm. "Inside." I stumbled through the doorway, and he shut it behind me. He locked the deadbolt and pushed a heavy chair against the door. "What is happening?" I whispered. He held a finger to his lips. We stood there listening. Footsteps moved down the hallway and stopped outside the apartment. Someone knocked once. 3 seconds later, they knocked again. The property manager didn't move. A man's voice came through the door. "Kevin?" The property manager looked at me. "Don't answer." The voice came again. "Kevin, I know you're in there." I could hear my own breathing. Then the voice changed. "And I know you're with the driver." My stomach dropped. The property manager's eyes widened. He mouthed, "Don't say anything." The person outside waited. Then we heard the sound of a phone vibrating in the hallway. Mine was still in my hand. I looked down. A new message had appeared from the same unknown number. "You should have left when I told you." I felt a rush of panic. The property manager saw the message and finally whispered, "How long has this been happening to you?" I told him everything. The house, the fake delivery, the abandoned building, Ashley, the note under my seat, and now the apartment. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said something that made the entire situation worse. "I've seen your name before." "Where?" "On the delivery logs." He explained that the apartment had been vacant for almost 6 months. The previous tenant had moved out suddenly after complaining about strangers entering the building at night. Security cameras had captured people coming through the lobby, but none of them ever used the apartment's intercom. They seemed to know when the cameras were being watched and would leave before security could reach them. "Why didn't you report it?" I asked. We did, twice. He told me the police had reviewed the footage but couldn't identify anyone because most of the cameras were old and the faces were obscured. Then, about a month earlier, delivery drivers began receiving orders to the empty apartment. Some drivers said the customer wasn't there. Others said someone opened the door and took the food without speaking. One driver claimed a woman inside asked him to stay because she was afraid someone was following her. He left. The next morning, police found her car abandoned several blocks away. Did they ever find her? I asked. He shook his head. No, the pounding on the door started again. This time it was harder. The chair moved slightly against the floor. Open the door, Kevin. The property manager grabbed his phone and dialed emergency services. I could see his hand shaking. He whispered the address and told the operator someone was trying to force their way into an apartment. Then the line went silent. He looked at his phone. No signal. I checked mine. My phone showed one bar, then none. The pounding stopped. For several seconds, the hallway was silent. Then the doorknob began turning slowly. The property manager stepped backward. There's a second exit, he whispered. Bathroom window. We rushed through the empty apartment. The bathroom was at the back, and the window opened onto a narrow alley behind the building. It wasn't an easy escape, but it was better than waiting for whoever was outside. The property manager opened the window and climbed through first. I followed, dropping down onto a dumpster lid and then onto the pavement. We ran toward the parking lot. I could hear footsteps behind us. I didn't look back. When we reached my car, I unlocked it and got inside. The property manager climbed into the passenger seat. Drive. I started the engine and pulled away. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station several miles away. Under the bright lights, everything suddenly felt less frightening. We called the police again, and this time the call went through. Officers arrived about 15 minutes later. We explained everything. They returned with us to the apartment complex, but whoever had been there was gone. The hallway door was unlocked and the apartment was empty. There was no sign of forced entry. The property manager showed them the delivery logs and security footage. One officer took my statement and asked whether I had received any threats. I showed him the messages. His expression changed when he saw them. Has this number contacted you before? I said yes. He photographed the screen. The officer then asked me something I hadn't expected. Did you ever give anyone access to your delivery account? No, he looked at the property manager. What about the restaurant? The property manager shook his head. No, the officer didn't explain why he was asking. Before I left, he told me to stop accepting deliveries to that address and to contact the department if I received another message. I went home and deleted the delivery app from my phone. For the first time in years, I seriously considered quitting. The next morning, I called the delivery company and told them I wanted my account permanently closed. They said they would process the request. I changed my phone number a few days later and replaced the locks on my apartment. For almost 2 months, nothing happened. Eventually, I started feeling normal again. I found another job during the day and stopped delivering completely. Then one afternoon, I received an envelope in my mailbox. There was no return address. Inside was a printed photograph. It showed me standing outside the first house on that Thursday night, holding the food delivery. The picture had clearly been taken from somewhere across the street. On the back, someone had written, "You kept coming back." I called the police. An officer came to my apartment, took the photograph, and asked whether I recognized the location where the picture had been taken. I told him I didn't. He studied it for a while, then asked me to look closely at the background. There was a dark vehicle parked behind my car. I hadn't noticed it that night. The officer zoomed in on the photograph and pointed at the windshield. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. We couldn't see the person's face, but the interior light revealed something hanging from the rearview mirror. It was a small delivery company identification badge. The officer looked at me. "Did you ever work with other drivers in that area?" I said no. He took the photograph with him. A week later, he called and told me they had found the vehicle. It belonged to a former delivery driver who had been fired months earlier for accessing customer information he wasn't supposed to have. According to the officer, he had been using old delivery records to identify addresses where drivers would arrive alone late at night. They suspected he was behind several fake orders and harassment incidents, but they couldn't connect him to the missing woman from apartment 307. They arrested him on unrelated charges after finding stolen customer data on one of his devices. I thought that would finally be the end of it. It wasn't. About 6 months later, I was cleaning out an old storage box when I found the folded note I'd photographed under my car seat. I had forgotten about it completely. On the back, beneath the words, "You were right," there was a second message I had never noticed because the paper had been folded over. It said, "The first house wasn't mine." I stared at those words for a long time. I called the detective who had handled my case and read the message to him. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he asked me, what was the address of that first delivery again? I gave it to him. He didn't respond for several seconds. Finally, he said, "That's strange." I asked why. He told me the house had been searched months earlier after the former driver was arrested. The owner had been out of town for almost a year. There was nobody living there. No Daniel. No Marcus. No one. The man who opened the side door had never been identified. The detective told me they found evidence that someone had been staying there temporarily, but whoever it was had left before the search. Then he said something I still think about whenever I see a delivery driver parked outside a house at night. "We found something in the upstairs bedroom." I asked what it was. He said there were dozens of printed photographs of delivery drivers taken from across the street dating back several years. Mine was one of them, but the detective said there was one detail they couldn't explain. My photograph had been taken 3 days before I ever accepted that first delivery.